Shalom, shalom, wonderful friend. It's great to see you. And yes, thank you, Laura, and Chag Sameach. Happy Yom Ha'atzmaut to all. And certainly a different one than most years. And I'm sorry for the delay. We're having some Wi-Fi issues here. And so if at some point the Wi-Fi goes out, just know that we'll be right back. But we are getting it addressed. In any case, I am excited to jump in with you to a topic that if I asked the average Jew on the streets what the 10 greatest Jewish ideas offered to the world are, this would probably be the most common one. Yeah, nothing personal, Judy. This would be the most common one shared, the idea of Tzelem Elokim, which we are going to look at together here. So let's start with a poll question. What makes humans most God-like? What gives us this notion of human rights? What is embedded within the human that makes us so unique from the rest of creatures? Is it our bodies? Is it our minds? Is it our souls? Is it our capacity to speak? Is it our freedom? So take a moment there. And if you make an imperfect choice and you want to in the chat write your perfect choice, feel free to add that over there as well. Very interesting. Nobody said it's our bodies. 25% said it's our minds. 50% said it's our souls. Nobody said our capacity to speak. The Unclists would be offended. Unclists thought it was our capacity to be speaking beings. 25% said our freedom. Okay, very interesting. Okay, friends, let's dive in together. We've got a lot to discuss, and I look forward to seeing where you go with this. A topic, a phrase that is so commonly quoted, but we can go so much deeper with. It's one of our most famous moments in Genesis, in all of Torah, perhaps, where God says, "Let us make a human in our image." And so God creates humankind, B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God. Generations of sages and thinkers have puzzled over this. What could it mean that God, master of the universe, the almighty, the eternal, made us in God's image or likeness? The most obvious and least convincing explanation, based on your voting and my own understanding, is that God has a corporeal form akin to our own, a giant figure up in heaven, with limbs and fingers, a nose, perhaps even a beard, a gray beard. Such an idea is easily dismissed. Rashi reminds us that supposing the creator to be corporeal and material would necessitate that the creator be finite. For it is impossible to imagine a body which does not end in dissolution. But we know that God is infinite, the Ein Sof, the one without end. So how could God be a finite physical being? Furthermore, if we were all created to physically look like God, how could we all look so different? The Talmud suggests as much, noting that when coins are struck from the same mold, they all look more or less the same. If you've been to the mint, you know what it looks like to produce money. However, the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He, made each man in the image of Adam, and yet not one of them resembles his fellow, right? Each one comes from the first one, but is completely different and unique. Unlike a money-producing machine. What it means to be struck in the image of God must be less about physical attributes and more about something on the level of the abstract. As a quick but important aside, I must acknowledge that the source material that I intend to be using may refer to humankind as mankind or man, and refer to God as he or him, something that I personally avoid in my own writing. I will not be using masculine language for God and for humankind, but it is critical to acknowledge the relationship between Tzelem Elokim and oppressive patriarchal structures that consider only men to be in the image of God. Although this conversation will be will not be offering an in-depth examination of the cultural construct of God as male. There is much to be read on this topic. For example, you might look at Feminism and Theology by Janet Margaret Soskis and Diana Lipton from Oxford University Press, 2003, Introducing Body Theology. Many other works to look at how God is depicted and how that has upheld patriarchal systems. In any case, where I am quoting modern thinkers who, and so I do try to retranslate ancient texts to be gender neutral, but modern thinkers, I keep their own. It makes no sense to change what they wrote. Anyways, all this is to say, if God is not a giant human in the sky, then we must think more deeply and imaginatively about what it means for us to be created in God's image. The moral possibilities and consequences of such thinking is why Tzelem Elokim is one of the great Jewish ideas. Let us return to the question, friends. What is it about a human being that makes us godly? The answers are various and revealing. A popular interpretation of Tzelem Elokim is that it is our capacity for reason that makes us godly. Rashi says as much, that we were created with the power to comprehend and discern. It is our cognitive, intellectual capacities that make us godlike. The Rambam, Maimonides, famously stressed the importance of man's intellect in his teachings on rationalism. In his Guide for the Perplexed, he calls our intellect strange in that it is not found in anything else that exists under the sphere of the moon. In order for humans to reason, the Rambam explains, we do not need to use our bodies at all, not our limbs and not our senses. In that way, our intellect can be likened to the experience of God, who does not require the instrument of a body to be said to exist. That's actually an important, interesting point. I'll come back to in a moment. It's the intellect that is divine, the Rambam therefore argues, and not the form of the body. Elsewhere, he continues to puzzle over what it means to be made in God's image. Regarding the relationship between form and substance, he writes that because we are in God's image, we can therefore intellectually apprehend abstract ideas such as angels, which are forms without substance. In this way, Maimonides writes, man is like the angels. So friends, just unpack this a little further here. Of course, he's deeply influenced by the Greeks, and the Greeks have a notion of an active intellect, right? And that's where Plato becomes a mystic a little bit, and a little bit theological, because that is the divine realm, this realm of the intellect that transcends the body. Now, if you're a type of neuroscientist today who understands that basically everything intellectual is a part of the brain, and the brain is a part of the body, and those two can't separate it, and there is no soul, and so really everything is body, then you have a theological problem for Maimonides, because God cannot be body. If what makes us godly is mind must be an out-of-body experience, hence the active intellect, that we are going beyond brain when we tap into the intellectual. Okay, so that's category one, is this kind of intellectual sphere. For others, such divine intellect is less a matter of reason or logical apprehension than it is our ability to study Torah. The medieval commentators Ovadia ben Yaakov Sforno asserts that what makes us B'Tselem Elokim is that we can acquire knowledge and insights by the study of Torah and by the practice of the laws of Torah. Access to Torah is, in his understanding, is what makes us godly, right? It's great that we can think of scientific innovations. It's great that we can, start new high-tech businesses and do all kinds of really smart things. But the highest intellect is when we're considering our most lofty values and our most lofty commitments, theologically and morally. And that is the enterprise of Torah, according to Sforno, as opposed to Maimonides, who, as we know, very much values the sciences and would think that it's connected to this kind of highest intellectual capacity, which is moral and theological as well. Further interpretations of in God's image are abundant. Some, such as the Swiss philosopher and Christian theologian Emil Brunner, assert that it is humans' capacity for speech that makes us godly. This is also the argument of Unclus, as I mentioned earlier. Others include the possibility of freedom and free will, right? That most beings are predictable in their behaviors, but humans are in many ways, but not always, unpredictable. That's one of the things that frustrates us about humans, is how unpredictable they are. And sometimes we're frustrated how predictable they are also. But what makes us godlike is that we are free, and God is absolutely free. So others suggest it's our capacity for self-actualization, the ability to transcend our own self-interest, and our capacity for empathy. In the Talmud, our sages consider that perhaps to be godly is to care for others, to clothe the naked, to visit the sick, to comfort mourners, to bury the dead. As we see in the Babylonian Talmud, Sota 14a, that to act godly is to care for others. In other words, it's our empathetic actions that makes us godly. Most elusively, there's the possibility that to be made B'Tzelem Elokim means that we are given a soul, and that soul itself is divine. I say that this is elusive because invoking the soul inevitably gives us more questions than answers. One way to test these assertions about what makes humans godly is to consider a human lacking that attribute. For example, to test the possibility that we're physically made in God's image, and it's our physical bodies that make us godly, we would ask ourselves, is a person who is missing a limb considered to be less in God's image? The answer is, of course, no. So it would appear it's not our physical form that makes us godly. To test Emil Brunner's idea that a human is godly because of their capacity for speech, we would ask ourselves, is a person whose speech is impaired or who is entirely nonverbal considered less godly? Again, the answer is, of course, no. So it would appear it is not entirely speech that makes us godly, because a human can be lacking that. What about a person who lacks reason, someone whose cognitive abilities are limited? Do we consider them less godly? Someone with Down syndrome? Of course not. The questions seem to get trickier the closer we get to the truth. Can we imagine a person entirely without empathy? Can we imagine, not so hard, can we imagine a person lacking a soul? Taking on this query from another angle, we can consider if we think a person can lose what makes them godly. Can a person lose this? If, for example, it's our capacity for morality and empathy that makes us like God, does that mean this quality can be lost? Can we become less godly through consistent immoral action? Or is the godliness in us something that cannot be broken or taken away, like the soul itself? These are inquiries without definitive answers. But even if we cannot pinpoint exactly what makes us godly, we can contemplate the profound implications of our godliness. For example, Tzelem Elokim gives birth to the concept of inalienable rights. For if we are each made in the image of God, then we are each owed the same fundamental decency. Another way to say this, because we are made in God's image, humans are never instrumental. We are an ends in ourselves, not a means. Our rights emerge from this concept. There's two kinds of rights for us to consider: social rights and natural rights. Natural rights are indelible. They cannot be revoked. They are inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, gender expression, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. In modern times, these include the right to life, freedom from slavery, the right to education, access to food, water, shelter. This is based on what are human rights by the United Nations. Not that United Nations is my moral guide in the world, but it is nonetheless an important institution, even when they err. Social rights, as compared to natural rights, are less fixed. We can agree, for example, that people in our society have the right to liberty, including freedom of movement. However, if you commit murder, you are incarcerated for the safety of society at large. Your freedom of movement is superseded by the collective's right to life. Or as the American political philosopher John Rawls might put it, incarceration, what he would call coercive enforcement, is part of how we uphold the structures of our societies in which the rights of individuals are prioritized. All of this is to say that social rights can be suspended, right? You can't suspend a natural right, but as a social right, we can suspend. I would invite every reader to think about the rights that they consider completely fixed versus the rights they find more relative? What are the rights that should never be taken away from anyone, regardless of what they have done? How might a society collectively, how a society collectively answers this question reveals much about its fabric. Consider, for example, voting rights in prisons. How fundamental do we consider the right to vote? If, as a country, we agree that voting rights should be suspended in prisons, although we do not agree, as the states of Vermont and Maine allow incarcerated individuals to retain voting rights, do we believe these rights should be restored upon the completion of sentence and probation? After all, in the United States, there's several states in which a felon's voting rights are never restored. Do we agree that committing a felony at any point in one's life means that person has lost the right to vote forever? Or consider the status of rights in war. In war ethics, the acceptable way to treat civilians differs greatly from the acceptable way to treat combatants. Namely, in just war theory, soldiers may justifiably be killed. However, it's wrong to kill a civilian. Well, that gets a little more complicated. But what if, for example, this is part of the complexities of the Israel-Gaza war, what if you know there are 3 Hamas terrorists in a tunnel and they are being shielded by 3 innocent civilians? Do you kill those 3 terrorists knowing you'll kill those 3 innocent civilians? What if you change those numbers? What if it's 3 Hamas terrorists and 1 civilian? What if it's 10 Hamas terrorists and 1,000 civilians? How do you even begin to calculate, given that you want to avoid, your aim is to kill combatants, your aim is to protect civilians, but civilians are used as a shield. Very complicated. Implied in this philosophy is that by being a soldier, a person has the right to an extent, suspend their right to life, right? When you enter as a soldier. Even the most fundamental natural right, the right to life, can therefore be suspended, right, based on this new context. In some cases, the public's comfort with certain rights being suspended may shift over time. Consider, for example, that historically the majority of Americans might have asserted that freedom from torture is a basic human right. In other words, that a government could never justifiably torture anyone regardless of their combat status. Presumably, this is why torture is a war crime, according to the United Nations. However, since the George W. Bush administration and the advent of so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, about half of Americans have routinely expressed that they find torture acceptable if it is related to anti-terrorism efforts. The other half of Americans presumably feel the CIA violated the God-given rights of political detainees through its torture program. Another complicating factor to consider is the issue of minors and the elderly, neither of which may have the full bevy of rights. Children cannot vote, children cannot drive, just as examples. Similarly, we can consider how a senior might have their driver's license revoked if their vision is impaired. This makes sense. Our streets would not be safe if children and the extreme elderly were driving cars and trucks. But it certainly does not mean that we consider children or the elderly less human or less godly. Rather, these practices reveal to us that individual rights are always operating in relationship to society as a whole. Everyone has basic human rights also introduces the issues of obligations. Let's assume that everyone has the right to safety, shelter, food, and water. These rights create obligations. On whom do these obligations fall? The answer is deeply varied. Certain human rights obligate individuals, for example. Another's right to safety obligates me not to be violent. Other rights create obligations for whole communities and societies. For example, the right to shelter creates obligations on a much bigger scale than the individual, requiring that whole cities and their infrastructure work to create affordable housing solutions. The concept of Tzelem Elokim gives us significant ethical imperatives. For if we are all made in the image of God, then to treat another person ethically is to serve God. Traditionally, there are 2 forms of obligations. Those between people, what the Talmud calls Bein Adam L'Chaveiro, and those between a person and God, Bein Adam L'Makom. However, if we consider that there's godliness in each human being, then there's a profound overlap between Bein Adam L'Chaveiro and Bein Adam L'Makom. To care for human beings is to care for God. This ought to be our most fundamental religious impulse. It's worth taking a moment to consider the word Tzelem itself. What might we conclude from the Hebrew? The word is mostly commonly translated as image, hence B'Tzelem Elokim translated as in the image of God. However, the word itself is more complex than that. In the Bible, the root Sadi Lamed Mem can refer to a picture, a figure, or a shadow. In later texts, it even comes to refer to an idol. These definitions remind us that the word Tzelem does not refer to God's essence, but something more like a gesture to the divine. What I mean is Tzelem Elokim reveals more about humans than it does about God. The great scholar and rabbi Yitz Greenberg says that because of Tzelem Elokim, we can understand three fundamental truths, which are paradoxical. It's about people. Everyone is infinitely valuable. Everyone is equal. Everyone is unique. The part that's paradoxical there is, or potentially conflicting and true at the same time, is how could people be equal but unique? Difference implies different value, and yet infinitely valuable and equally valuable, even though radically different. So now in the face of it, tenet 2 and 3, as mentioned, are contradictions. How can we be equal and unique? Surely being unique implies difference, which implies a lack of equality, potentially. However, both of these contradictory truths can be true. Part of what can emerge for us in allowing both these tenets to be true is how deeply important religious diversity is. Because each human being is part of a great manifestation or expression of divinity in the world, then we need the full diversity of humankind to paint a portrait of the divine, a portrait that we all collaborate on. This paradox is part of the larger biblical paradox in which we must accept that everyone is one, and yet there is still difference. Such an idea was an innovation in the world thousands of years ago. It is still desperately relevant today. It's not enough to simply say we are made in God's image. No, we must appreciate what this truly asks of us. It's a radical idea that we can't, for example, simply tolerate people experiencing homelessness in the world. We can't tolerate human abuse. Because when such things happen in our society, it's literally God who's under attack. The concept of Tzelem Elokim also matters within us, meaning how we treat and talk to ourselves. If we truly internalize that we are made in God's image, we can never lose our sense of self-worth. For some of us, it's perhaps easier to look outward, to remind ourselves that every human being is equally valuable, and to let that imperative drive our change-making and social justice work. However, I encourage us to also let this belief feel true for us. If everyone is infinitely valuable, then you are infinitely valuable. You are infinitely valuable, not because of the greatest things you've ever done, not because of some accomplishment in the workplace, some act of service, some brilliant idea, some important piece of artwork. Your infinite value is inherent to your being. There's nothing you have to do to earn your value. I hope that concept gives us permission to take rest when we need it. Because even when we are not doing the great things we feel called to do, even when we are taking a break or taking a rest or taking care of ourselves, we are as valuable as anyone else on earth. Friends, to conclude, it's often commented upon that the Torah does not use the language of rights, but the language of obligations. After all, rights can be passive or theoretical, talking about liberty, happiness. However, obligations demand action. From the Torah's preference for obligations over the concept of rights, I think we can learn to push the conversation on human rights forward. Let's think in terms of obligations, individual, communal, societal. If we really believe we are made in God's image, then this belief moves beyond the realm of theological debate. It is, in fact, a moral charge to develop those very systems that protect each infinitely valuable human being. whether that be a system of consciousness, a legislative system, or even a practice of self-care. By committing fully to the concept of Tzelem Elokim, we commit fully to our shared humanity. Okay, friends, that is our kickoff thoughts. And I would love to open a conversation with whoever wants to jump in here. Okay, Lauren, please start us off.
A few comments, and then I want to kind of expand on what you said. That that's a book everybody should read, by the way. Rabbi Yitz's The Triumph of Life. It's amazing. It's foundational for what we are. Just quickly to answer, I looked it up. Canadian prisoners can vote, all of them. It's by special ballot. They apply, and they get a mail-in ballot. The thing about terrorists, it would come under the concept of rodef. So it's someone pursuing you, looking to kill you. So, and the IDF does everything they can to avoid killing civilians, and of course their own hostages. And there's some examples where it's of terrorists actually mocking IDF soldiers by holding a baby and daring them to shoot them. So it's horrific. I've heard testimony on some programs. I just want to quote this from Rabbi Yitz in a program I took about his book, from Hadar. And this is where he talks about all human beings are equal. He says the value of every human is limitless. Then there is no way to say that the value of one person is greater or lesser than the value of another. But the consequences of such an idea are still far-reaching, and it forms the foundation of the whole of Torah and Jewish living. And I think it's actually the greatest gift that we gave to the world, because if not every human being is of value, equal value, then you can just kill whoever you want. Kings can rule and treat the rest like peasants. And this is, like, I think, the foundation, any kind of humanity. So that's what I have to say. Thanks.
Awesome, Lauren. Yeah, thank you so much. There's a bunch to pick up on there. Firstly, interesting enough, our because we are a people of action, our broad theological claims have to take a side in the end. Even though we say each people are infinitely valuable, the rabbis of the Talmud are going to push us to take a side. And the side they take is that my life matters more than yours. That is to say, if you find the canteen in the desert, the choice is not taken that we both die because we can't choose only one of us. And the choice is not taken that I give the canteen of water to you to live and let myself die. The choice in the Talmud is, if there's one canteen, I must drink my canteen. Then I could try to do whatever I can to save the other person's life. But my life does take precedence to someone else's life. Now, that doesn't mean in the realm of luxuries and enjoyment. It has to do in basic survival. And going back to your point of rodef, Lauren, that's also why the person pursuing me, I have a right to defend myself, even kill them to protect myself. Now, but let people might shake with what I'm about to say. Because I know I'm going to shake when I say it. But the Klausenberger Rebbe said the Holocaust could have been worse. How could the Holocaust have been worse? He said, we could have been the murderers rather than the murdered. Now, that's a really profound point. Is that true? If we had to choose between being a murderer or the murdered, which would we choose? And generally, now, which is very different than saying kill or be killed, right? Murder is different than kill. And in the Ten Commandments, we don't say do not kill. We say do not murder. Very different. In any case, it's apropos to how we think about conflict. Nonetheless, it runs up against this idea of our life versus someone else. But here's the last thing I want to say just on this point here, Lauren, about how important this is. I want to remind us that prior to the Torah, this idea did not exist. What was the legal framework before Torah? The Code of Hammurabi. Mm-hmm. And what is the punishment? I've said this before, but it's worth saying all the time, that the punishment for killing your slave is it's a monetary crime. You owe the monetary value of the slave. The Torah comes and is not so radical to say we're going to eradicate slavery immediately, but it says if you kill a slave, it's a capital crime. not a monetary crime, not a financial crime. And so that was a massive innovation in the world, to say that every human being, even those that in this broken economic infrastructure of slavery are owned, is a full life. And if you kill your slave, that's an act of murder. And so yes, I think this is an idea for us to fight for in the world. Okay, Stan and Cheryl, I'm not sure which of you, but we'll find out in a moment.
You get me.
Okay, great.
So here we're taught this very lofty idea of us being created in God's image. And it was that in Parshat Breshit. So 2 or 3 parshas later, God says, I want to do a do-over. This was really a terrible mistake. So how do we balance that? And did we change as a result of that story? Is there any indication in the Torah that changes were made as a result of what I call a do-over?
That is such an awesome question. That is such an awesome question. So this case is used by those who believe one can lose their Tzelem Elokim. This is argued. Some argue that you cannot lose it in any case. And others argue that the Torah's permission for a death penalty, not to mention God's use of it, as you mentioned, demonstrates that one can lose it. And when a person is given the death penalty, that is okay, because that person is as if they've lost it. Now, that is, of course, contradicted by the law that comes in the Torah that says you have to immediately bury that body of the person who was put to death, because this is a shame to God, implying that they haven't lost it. So that's the counter argument, that actually one can't lose it. Even that person who's given the death penalty, who one argues has lost it, represents the image of God and should be buried. And but in terms of the conversation of do-over, was there something fundamentally different? And here we might tap into the idea this capacity is something that does in fact evolve, that in some sense people can become more godly by actualizing themselves as well, not only less. And that something was lost after the Garden of Eden as it dropped 10 generations towards the generation of the flood. And something is being enhanced today, all the more so. And so I think your question is so much better than any answer. But I just want to remind us that there was no full do-over, right? It wasn't like humanity was going to be recreated. It still was Noah and the family that were built off of. And so whatever was there from the start was still what was being built off. But let me pause there, Stan, to see if you have any follow-up on some of those reflections or pushback. Yeah.
No follow-up.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a great it's a great point, and it's one of the mysteries. I would put in the category of one of the mysteries of does it evolve? Can it grow? Can it be lost? What does it mean for God to destroy Sodom and Amorah? What does it mean for God to bring the flood? What does that mean for godliness in the world? So yes. So thank you, David. Hi, David.
Hello, Rabbi. Hello, everybody. Yes, just a quick question. So, of course, I believe infinitely valuable means all people, not just Jewish people. So, and I know, I have no answers for Israel, what's happening in Israel. But I hear you in saying that in Jewish tradition, you can defend yourself. You have to defend yourself. But the Torah is instructing us, I think, that this is so difficult because we are all created in God's image. And it's so hard to know the answers.
Yeah, it is really hard to know the answers. And part of our difficulty is the emergence of the nation state. Because what the nation state suggests is that a society is more obligated to its own society than another society. And a leader of a nation state is more obligated to their citizens than they are to other people's citizens. And thus, I can say that all humans are created equal, and yet I have to defend my citizen against your citizen, and prioritize my citizen over your citizen. Now, the development of the nation state is a form of progress in one sense, and it also creates this new dilemma for us around how do we balance this sense of unique commitments with kind of global commitments, and this issue of defense. Now, a reminder on the case of rodef. By the way, rodef is used in abortion. The Talmud uses the language of rodef for why the fetus should be cut up to protect the mother. The mother should be protected because there is a pursuer. Rodef means a violent pursuer. And that fetus that is challenging the mother's health is deemed a violent pursuer who can be put up to protect the mother. So it's the same language there of rodef. But over by rodef, who comes into the house, the halakha wrestles with three approaches. It says three positions. Some say you must kill the rodef coming in your house. Some say not that you must, but you can. And some say you cannot, but if you do, you're not liable. No, there is no position there that says you may not. It's either you must, you can, or you cannot, but you're not liable. Now, all of those three positions around the rodef coming into your house in the Talmud applies to nighttime, not daytime. Daytime is a very different situation. In any case, thank you, David, for that. And the complexity, and that's why I think Tzelem Elokim I almost cringe when I hear it sometimes, not because we use it so often, but because it's often used as if it gives us the moral answers. I think it actually raises the moral questions rather than gives us the moral answers in many cases. Once again, consider the case of an end-of-life person. Someone is 99 years old, and we're extending their life. Someone could say, oh, they're created with Tzelem Elohim in the image of God. Of course we should extend their life as far as we possibly can. Someone else might say, the resources that are extending that 99-year-old person's life could save 10 children. And because we care the image of God, we can take a utilitarian perspective and save 10 children rather than that one. Right? Someone might say, with abortion, right, that this mother's created in the image of God, we should defend her rights right to the end. Someone else might say that fetus, I think, theologically is already in the image of God and has an equal weight to the mother, right? Those political debates can use the same concept in very different ways, and that's why I think Torah is so weakened when it's used kind of very loosely for political arguments, when you can say the exact opposite. You can say the exact opposite, just like in warfare. It goes in warfare. So, okay, Cheryl, over to you, Cheryl.
In this very new awareness of gender assignment, that reaffirms my belief that body has nothing to do with B'Tselem Elohim. Because if someone is born with a particular body, but is intellectually and emotionally and soulfully inclined towards a different gender, then that goes towards some of the other definitions of B'Tselem Elohim.
Yeah, great. Yes, thank you. I think that's a really interesting example of how the body is confining and not constitutive of this deeper dimension. So there's a lot to say about the whole gender issue, which probably goes beyond the scope of this moment, unless people want to go there. But I think that's a great example. And what many trans folks talk about is that they feel trapped in a foreign body. Perhaps we've all had that experience ourselves as well in our own bodies. People, someone who doesn't identify as trans may have that experience of feeling something at times in their life foreign to their own body, based upon, things that can occur. Anyways, Cheryl, thanks for that. And that's exactly in line with the approach I want to take, that if we say, that we do some test experiments to show why certain things cannot be what make us Tzelem Elohim. Okay, hi Judy.
Hi. It seems to me that talking about B'Tselem Elokim makes it very easy to explain or to counter against people who fight and say homosexuality is unnatural, because God created this one, and that one, and we're all created in the image of God. And you shouldn't be demeaning anybody for having different natural tendencies. You can demean them for abusing their humanity, and you can encourage them to be their better selves. But I think along the same lines that Cheryl was talking about, sexuality and gender identification is of one's essence. And that is godly, and it's a great shame for someone to say that is unnatural or not godly.
Yes, Judy, thank you. Yes, that well, and to go even further with what Judy's saying, a different argument of Tzelem Elohim could be that it's the whole package. We can't isolate speech or cognition or body. It's the whole package of the human being and everything that they were created as that makes them then godly. And I think in addition to sexual orientation, one could say the same about race. I mean, gender is explicit there. Yeah, I mean, thank God, literally, that it says man and woman there. Had it not, we might have had a question, throughout history, even though it didn't seem to prevent people from, disenfranchising women of basic rights throughout history. Race ought to be another good example for what Judy's referring to, that because one is born brown or black or white or anything in between, racism is a fundamental attack on godliness, in a sense. It's a religious problem, not just a societal and moral and political problem, in a sense. So, yeah, I appreciate that. And the suggestion that God has made me this way is a really important point, because if we strip away the divine design, we might say, well, this is a mistake in evolution, right? Gay people are not of the evolution plan, right? Because gay people can't naturally reproduce, right? Or other silly arguments like this that one might go down if we thought that humans in their essence were not somehow perfect. Okay, thank you.
Also,
Judy, you want to respond to that? Yeah.
If you will,
yes.
In Bereshit, it says that God created them man and woman, and in one of the creation stories. Yes. And there's an implication that God created the range of people from masculine to feminine, or both.
Great.
So
very nice.
We've all got some of that in each of us.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah, I think that's an interesting read. That it could be read as binary, or it could be read as non-binary. Yeah, thank you. And the Talmud itself has 4 genders, which is beyond the scope of our conversation right now. But there's 4 genders discussed in the Talmud, not just 2, and that could be a whole session in itself. So, thank you.
These are questions I wrote down, and they're not, I think, as profound as some of the discussions we've had so far, but they still are things I'd like to know. How does God describe himself or herself? Is there an admonition to think likewise, or the possibility of punishment to follow if you don't think likewise? And does God say there are things which humans cannot hope to achieve that he or she has in his or her life?
So if I understand your second question, are you saying are there things that humans cannot do that only God can do?
Yes, and does God actually say that? because I'm sure there are lots of things I can do that even that I can't do that other humans can do.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And bringing me back to your first question.
First question is, and I'm sorry for interrupting you. How does
Thank you.
God describe himself or herself? Is there any explicit description that God offers? This is who I am.
Oh, great, great. I love the burning bush story to remind us of it. That Moshe says, it's hard to not see it as the movie, that scene. But who should I say has sent me? And that famous phrase was just so amazing. Yeah, I share. Yeah, right. Which could be translated in many ways. In the movie, they say, "I am that I am," which is the way many texts translate it. Right. That another way could be that a description of becoming rather than of essence. I will be what I will be. Another way is to say, get out of here. Either it's a really deep answer or it's a non-answer. Like, get out of here, because as Steve is saying, like, I can't describe myself. And part of that might be because human minds cannot comprehend. And part of that might be because, hey, that's not the project I put you in the world for. I didn't put you in the world to be expert theologians to figure out this and that. I put you in the world to go repair the world. So stop trying to figure out things you can't figure out and focus on the things I need you to do, right? You might say. But of course, it's a great debate, because the mystics and the Hasidic thinkers, they want to dive deep, deep, deep into figuring out what's God's essence and how we can understand that and meditate on that and go deep into it. And then there's Maimonides, who thinks that every description is avodah zarah, it's idolatrous. Anything that we say God is fundamentally wrong. It's called his negative theology. You can only say what God is not what God is. And it's a major problem, according to Maimonides, to try to do that. So in any case, what God describes is what God does rather than what God is. You are to be rachum v'chanun, erech apayim v'rav chesed v'emet, right? We are to be kind, slow to anger, merciful, compassionate. That's what it says over and over, that we are to emulate, not something of being, but something of doing, a way of being gentle, compassionate, and kind in the world. And thankfully, Jewish liturgy love that. The creators of Jewish liturgy built this in so deeply to the liturgical experience on high holidays and beyond, that the most important thing about dimension of how we can relate to any God is by making ourselves more compassionate. Which doesn't mean, well, what about the text that shows that God is angry? And what about the time where it says that God, does the flood? It says, forget all that. You can study it. You can think about it. But your takeaway is be the merciful side of God. Okay, now to go to your second point, it's very telling that what's the very first mitzvah of the Torah? Anyone? The very first mitzvah of the Torah is Peru Urvu. Peru Urvu. And to be fruitful and multiply. And that's very interesting, because you might say God creates humans. That's the most amazing thing God does, really, what creates the world. And then God says initially, I want you all to go be creative like me and create humans. I want you to do that. Now, the Me'am ways, I find this comforting to people struggling with infertility or for other reasons haven't had children, because the Me'am Lo'ez says that the mitzvah Peru Urvu is spiritual creativity rather than biological reproduction. To be intellectually and spiritually creative is to emulate the divine's creative capacity. Also, a huge side note, but I have a friend and colleague who his wife recently gave birth to twins who were stillborn, and very late in the game. And it was around Pesach time, and they found some comfort. I mean, you can never find comfort, but you found some comfort in the Midrash that talked about how when the Am Yisrael crossed through the sea, they went through Kriyat Yam Suf, that the fetuses were also singing. They were also singing songs of liberation as the Israelites crossed through the sea. That they felt that their fetuses, their twins, were a part of the people, a part of the liberation song, even though they were never born. And they found some comfort in that. In any case, last thing to say there, Steve, is that the Jewish theologians distinguish between yesh miyesh and yesh me'ayin. Yesh miyesh means creating something from something. Yesh me'ayin means creating something from nothing. And they generally say only the divine does yesh me'ayin, creating something from nothing. But the humans, on the highest level possible, can create something from something. And that ought to be a source of our humility, that it's our resources and the ideas we've inherited and so much more, which has given us the capacity for creativity. But creating something from nothing is one of the very few places that Maimonides breaks from the Greeks. The Greeks think the world is eternal. Maimonides follows the Jewish theology. One of the very few times he breaks from them and says, no, the world was created, because he views it as necessary to understand that this was created from nothing as opposed to from something. In any case, I didn't even scratch the surface of your great questions there, Steve. But just to leave room for one more person who wants to jump in, I'll pause there if there's one more person.
I'll share. I feel I just like listening and learning, to be honest. I'm for those who don't know, I'm a rabbi in Texas. Mine's just a quick story. So years ago, I'm going to do a high holiday sermon in 30 seconds here. I had a man come and visit me at the congregation who was looking around the sanctuary. He was a Christian, and on his way out the door, ultimately told me that he loves all people because he was taught in his religion that we should love all people. He said, Jesus loves all people, so I love all people. So I said, okay, great. There should be more like you. And then he repeats it again, unprompted, all people. And I said, great. And then he adds, before he walks out the door, he says, oh, by the way, there are some people who aren't deserving of our love, and we should go over there and nuke them. These are exact words. So I said, look, I've got a student waiting for me, and I just kind of blew it off. So I spent the rest of the summer talking with all my local Christian clergy. I'm well aware this isn't Christianity, right? This is kind of a weird version. But I played that scenario out. Like, I know what he was trying to do. He was trying to curry favor with me, like by wink, wink, referencing, people we should collectively hate. But I responded to him, in my sermon, basically, in his absence, by saying, what would it be if I went in and professed that I believed that all people were created but Tzelem Elohim, right? What qualification, what condition could I put on it? And the answer is there isn't one, right? I'm stuck with the burden of having to say, I treat all people as if they were created but Tzelem Elohim, period, end of story. I can't even play into, but some people should. So when I hear about Tzelem Elohim, that story comes to my mind, that it's a holy challenge to believe it and to understand it, and for it to push us in the way we behave toward other people, even people we may not like. So, just
awesome. Thank you, Rabbi. I'm so glad you shared that, and it's a great place to end on, thinking about how some of the greatest evils in the history of the world have been done by the theologies and philosophies that suspend the dignity of people based on sometimes very lofty ideas. The Nazis had a very lofty ideal. We want to cleanse the race, right? We want to redeem humanity from race pollution, right? Wow. I mean, this was enlightened Germany, right? In the name of evolution, we want progress. We want humans to be their best. And so let's get rid of all those weak race polluters, right? And it wasn't hard to convince people that this was a noble idea. So too the notions of racism. Once you actually see a person of color and you say, this person fundamentally inferior, or a woman who is so obviously fundamentally inferior because of X, Y, and Z, right? That societies have been convinced over time, or violent Christianity that said, clearly, what makes us godlike is the embrace of Jesus Christ as our Savior. And someone who denies that as a heretic, right? They've lost their image of God. Like, they should be killed. They're a heretic. So we see the same thing in Islam. Thankfully, we don't have that idea manifest in Judaism. I mean, you'll find a few extremist texts, but they never took off. And that's where Levinas really comes in, to say that the response to that Holocaust ideology is the face of a human, like Rabbi Katz is saying, that there is no classifier. Once you have a category, then you can do great evil to people who don't fit into that category. It is simply the face of the human that ought to awaken this deep moral obligation. Friends, the last thing I'll say is, what I hope is morally challenging to each of us is not that we walk out saying, aren't we great? We're Jews. We all believe in Tzelem Elohim, and so we're on the right side of history. All of us hold biases. We all hold biases, and we don't have to be ashamed of that, because it's natural to humans. It's how our brains work. But to be a little introspective on what are some of the biases I hold that tell me that these people matter and these people don't matter? How can I interrogate those biases a little deeper that have led me to believe from my early childhood experiences and beyond that some people matter and a whole bunch of people don't, or matter less? And that can be very generative for us to do some of that work in such polarized times, where there are so many wars and factions, and we can come to think that only certain types of people matter. Friends, it was great to be with you and to learn from you. I'm sorry we went 3 minutes over time and started 3 minutes late, but have a wonderful day.